Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep this time into some really recent true crime stories.
Yeah.
The ones that have been sent in. Get ready because we're talking murder-suicides. We're going to cover some baffling disappearances and even a totally sinister bombing plot.
Wow, it's a really heavy lineup, and I think as we go through these cases, it's really important to remember that we're dealing with real lives that are affected by these events.
Absolutely. So why don't we start with
Yeah.
the case that has kind of been making the headlines recently, the Chad Dorman case. This father from Ohio is accused of killing his 3 young sons, and the details are, they're just heart-wrenching.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me about this case is just the contrast between the horrific nature of the crime
Yeah.
and, Chad Dorman's reported demeanor, like right after it happened. Witnesses describe him as calm, almost like detached, immediately after this happened. And it really makes you wonder what could drive a person to do such a thing.
Yeah, there's another layer to this case that I think adds a whole other fascinating legal dimension to it. A judge actually ruled that Chad's confession
Yeah.
was inadmissible because he wasn't properly read his Miranda rights.
Right, and that's a key point here. The judge in this case basically determined that his right to counsel was violated.
Yeah.
And that could have, really significant implications for the trial. And it raises a lot of important questions about due process and, the balance between, protecting individual rights while also making sure that justice is served.
It's a really stark reminder that even when you're dealing with, such a just horrific crime, the legal system still has to, operate with precision. And to make this whole thing even more complex, Chad's lawyers, they've gotten involved in some really unusual motions, including one that requests that convicted felons should be allowed to actually serve on the jury.
Wow, that's a bold move. It'll be very interesting to see how the prosecution responds to this and what the judge ultimately decides. But it does raise some interesting questions about who we consider fit to judge others, particularly in a case that's as, sensitive as this one.
Definitely. Now let's shift gears a little bit to a different case, one that's equally tragic but in a very different way. The double homicide in Miami, where 2 young women, Megan Moore and Sydney Capolino, were killed by Megan's ex-boyfriend, Louis, who then ended up taking his own life. This is the case of domestic violence that escalated with, really just devastating consequences.
It really does highlight the tragic reality of domestic violence and just the absolutely devastating impact that it has on individuals, on families, on whole communities. And I think what's particularly disturbing is that, often there are warning signs that, go unnoticed or they're just ignored.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
And in this case, we have to ask ourselves, could anything have been done to prevent this? I mean, were there missed opportunities, to intervene?
It's a question that just haunts so many cases that are like this. One of the details that really caught my attention in this particular case was that Luis had recently been evicted from his apartment because of financial difficulties. And while, it's hard to say for certain whether this was a direct trigger for this. We do know that financial strain is a factor in a lot of domestic violence situations. So it just kind of adds another layer of complexity to this already just heartbreaking situation.
It's true. It's a reminder that these situations are rarely simple, and there's often, multiple factors at play. And it also underscores the need for, really comprehensive support systems that address not just the immediate crisis, but also those underlying issues that contribute to domestic violence in the first place. Now, let's move on to a case in Georgia. This one is truly chilling, and it's premeditation and brutality. It involves 2 men, Stephen Glosser and Caleb Kinsey. They're accused of not just bombing a woman's house, but also plotting to kill her daughter using just an absolutely horrifying array of methods.
I mean, this goes way beyond, just a simple act of violence. It really shows a calculated plan with just some really disturbing details. The lengths that they allegedly went to, mapping out the house, acquiring a python, arrows. I mean, even dead rats. It just paints a picture of deliberate cruelty.
It's almost unimaginable, the level of premeditation and the callous disregard for human life. And to add to the horror, the bombing happened just one day after the woman moved into her new home.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it was almost a deliberate attempt to shatter any sense of safety or security.
The timing of it all really does suggest a desire to maximize the psychological impact, to make the victim feel completely vulnerable, completely violated. I think this case really raises those profound questions about what drives people to such extremes. I mean, what motivates such calculated cruelty?
It's a question that criminologists and and psychologists have grappled with for so long,
Mhm.
trying to understand, the factors that contribute to this kind of behavior. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it mental illness? Is it societal influences? It's a very complex puzzle with no easy answers.
Yeah, it really is
Now,
it's a chilling reminder, of the dark potential that exists even within people who seem ordinary. And it leads us to another case that I think raises some troubling questions
yeah.
about the safety and well-being of vulnerable individuals, particularly, in the entertainment industry. And I'm talking about the allegations of abuse
Mm.
and misconduct
Mm.
surrounding Nickelodeon, the ones that were brought to light by the docuseries Quiet on the Set.
This case. I mean, this case is really shaken. What a lot of us thought was like this wholesome part of our childhoods. It's disturbing to even think about it. The behind the scenes of all those shows that we loved, there could be this darker reality going on.
Yeah.
So this docuseries really delves into, the network's history, specifically the accusations against Dan Schneider, the guy who created some of Nickelodeon's biggest hits.
I think what's really compelling about this case is just the sheer volume of accusations from all the different people, who worked on his shows. And while Schneider has denied, all the allegations, the consistency of the accounts, detailing these specific instances of, alleged behavior. I mean, it's hard to just dismiss it all. The docuseries paints this really disturbing picture of a toxic environment where young actors
Mhm.
might have been subjected to inappropriate conduct.
It is really unsettling,
Yeah.
especially considering that there were convicted sex offenders like Jason Handy and Brian Peck,
Yeah.
who were employed by Nickelodeon during the same time. And it raises questions about the network's responsibility,
Yeah.
in protecting these young actors and,
Right.
and whether there were systemic failures that have allowed this kind of behavior to just continue.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that these individuals were even able to operate within the Nickelodeon system is really concerning. I mean, it points to some potential vulnerabilities in the way the industry vets people and the need for, just stronger safeguards
Yeah.
to prevent, these kinds of individuals from having access to young performers.
The case against Brian Peck is especially disturbing, given that Drake Bell, one of the stars from Drake and Josh, publicly identified himself as the victim in Peck's sexual abuse case. His account provides just this really chilling glimpse into the manipulative tactics that abusers employ. It highlights the long-lasting impact that this kind of trauma can have on victims.
It's really commendable that Bell came forward. It underscores the importance of speaking out against abuse, no matter how powerful the perpetrator might be. And his testimony sheds light on the power dynamics that often exist, in the entertainment industry, where these young actors who are just starting out, they might feel pressured to stay silent because they're afraid of jeopardizing their careers.
You're right. It's a stark reminder that abuse can happen anywhere, even in seemingly glamorous and safe environments like Hollywood. So what about Dan Schneider's response to all of this? I mean, he's admitted to being a tough boss, but he's denied any serious wrongdoing. He even offered to cut jokes from his shows that were considered inappropriate. What do you make of his response?
It feels really calculated. It feels like classic crisis management. He acknowledges some level of responsibility, by saying that he was demanding. But at the same time, he's trying to deflect the more serious allegations, by framing them as misunderstandings or exaggerations. And that offer to cut jokes, it seems like an attempt to appear conciliatory, but it doesn't really address the core issue of the alleged abuse.
So it makes you wonder if his response is genuine remorse or just a strategic move to protect his reputation. And the network statement regarding the docuseries, it didn't really offer much clarity either. They basically just said that they take all allegations seriously and they've got these really rigorous processes in place to make sure that the working environment is safe.
It's a pretty generic response. It doesn't really address the specific allegations made in the docuseries, so it just leaves a lot of unanswered questions and raises concerns about how committed the network is to being transparent and being held accountable.
So before we move on to the next topic, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing search for Riley Strain. He's that 22-year-old University of Missouri student who vanished in Nashville during a fraternity trip. This case is particularly baffling because of the conflicting accounts and the just lack of any real concrete leads.
Riley's disappearance it's a stark reminder of how quickly things can just spiral out of control and leave loved ones, just desperate for answers. And the fact that he was last seen on these surveillance videos, just walking, running, stumbling through the city. and looking intoxicated, I mean, just adds to the mystery. And then you've got the bartender's statement saying that he only had one drink at Luke Bryan's bar, but his parents believe that he'd been drinking heavily all day. So it's just a puzzle with too many missing pieces.
And then there's the discovery of Riley's bank card by a group of TikTokers who were volunteering in the search. And the fact that his wallet was missing.
Yeah.
And that the card was found on the riverbank, but not near the water. I mean, it raises more questions than answers. Could this be a case of misadventure, fueled by alcohol? Or is there something more sinister going on?
It's really impossible to say for sure, based on the evidence that we have right now. And the conflicting accounts from the bartender, from his parents, and the eyewitness who described him as being severely intoxicated, it just makes the investigation even more complicated. And while the police haven't said that they suspect foul play, Riley's family is understandably unconvinced.
It's clear that they're frustrated with the pace of the investigation and the scope of it, and they believe that more could be done to find their son. It just highlights the immense emotional toll that these missing persons cases take on families, especially when there's no closure.
This case really shows just how complex these missing persons investigations can be, especially when alcohol is involved. And that lack of clear answers just amplifies the anguish and the uncertainty that Riley's loved ones are feeling. It's a reminder of the importance of being vigilant and taking personal responsibility and the need for more effective support systems for families that are going through such just traumatic situations.
It's heartbreaking. And it really underscores the importance of looking out for each other, especially when you're in unfamiliar environments. And before we wrap up, I kind of want to circle back to that case in Georgia. The one involving Stephen Glosser and Caleb Kinsey. I mean, that alleged plot to harm the woman and her daughter. It's just so disturbing. It's hard to even wrap my head around it. The level of premeditation and cruelty is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it really goes beyond what we typically see in acts of violence, the planning, the acquisition of these unusual weapons like the python and the arrows, and the fact that they were targeting a family member. I mean, it all just points to a really deep-seated animosity and a desire to not only inflict physical harm but also psychological torment.
Right. It's criminologists call it instrumental aggression. It's where violence is used as a tool to achieve a specific goal. And it seems like in this case, the goal is revenge, or maybe even like a twisted sense of control.
And that bombing of the woman's house, just a day after she moved in,
That's right. Yeah.
It's very telling, and it suggests that they wanted to completely disrupt her life, to make her feel totally unsafe, totally vulnerable, and the fact that they allegedly planned to use all these different, disturbing methods to harm her daughter. I mean, it speaks to a level of sadism that's really frightening.
It's a case that really forces us to confront the darkest parts of human nature, and just acknowledge that potential for violence that exists, even in people who seem ordinary. I think as we delve into these true crime cases, it's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism and the whodunit aspect of it all. But we have to remember that these aren't just stories. These are real tragedies that have affected real people, real families, real communities.
You're absolutely right. It's essential to approach these cases with sensitivity and with respect. Recognizing that behind the headlines and behind the legal proceedings are real lives that have been shattered. And while we may never fully understand what drives someone to commit these kinds of acts, by exploring these cases, by trying to understand the motivations, the circumstances, hopefully we can gain some insights into the darker side of human nature, and maybe even contribute to preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening in the future.
It's important to remember that even in the midst of all these dark stories, there's still hope. There are people, there are organizations out there working tirelessly to seek justice, to support victims, to prevent future harm.
That's a really important point. We often focus so much on the perpetrators and the horrific nature of their crimes, but it's equally important to highlight the work that's being done by law enforcement, by victim advocates, by community organizations, to address these issues, to support those who've been affected.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive, from murder-suicides and missing persons to shocking bombing plots and disturbing allegations in the entertainment industry. I mean, we've really explored some complex and challenging cases. What are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will take away from all of this?
I think the most important takeaway is that these cases, they're not isolated incidents. They're really a reflection of larger societal issues, things like domestic violence, child exploitation, mental health, the misuse of power. And I think by understanding the factors that contribute to these tragedies, we can start to address them and hopefully create a safer and more just society for everyone.
So what about the role of the media in all of this? We've seen how the coverage of these cases can shape public perception and even influence, the course of justice. What are your thoughts on responsible reporting in this age of instant news and social media?
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue. I mean, the media, they have a responsibility to report on these cases accurately, fairly, but there's always that risk of sensationalism,
Mm,
of exploitation.
yeah.
And as consumers of media, I think it's important for us to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives that we're being presented with and seek out multiple perspectives so that we can form our own informed opinions.
I couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up this exploration into the darker side of humanity, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, while these cases can be unsettling, and they can be disturbing. They don't define us as a species. There's still so much good in the world, so much kindness, so much compassion, so much love. And I think it's important to focus on amplifying those qualities, on building communities of support, and on creating a world where these kinds of tragedies become less and less frequent.
That's beautifully said. And to our listeners out there, we encourage you to continue the conversation. Share your thoughts on these cases with your friends, with your family. Support organizations that are working to make a difference. And most importantly, never stop believing in the power of hope and the possibility of a better future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
Yeah.
Have probably